Okay, shifting gears and sadly to a somewhat more gloomy, but certainly very interesting topic. We're going to look at what the horrible war in Ukraine actually means for the global international monetary system. It's done more than just produce, these horrific stories of deaths. It's really exposed a challenge to that international monetary order that the US has led for so long. And we're going to delve into what that means for crypto, because it means a lot. So joining me on stage right now is Bruno Macaes. He is a prolific author on geopolitical issues and an advisor to Flint Global. Zehavi, who's an investor at Daneel Capital, and Nic Carter, general partner at Castle Island Ventures. Please welcome them to the stage. Bruno, thank you. Maya. Hey, Nick. Okay, so, we'll try to make this upbeat and happy. It's not exactly the sort of topic that I wanted to be talking about at Consensus, although I've always thought that, since we wrote a book, The Age of Cryptocurrency. It's a shameless plug for a book that if you haven't read, you should read, written in 2015, and we actually addressed this issue, that at some point, this question about the structure of the international monetary system, the supremacy of the dollar, the US role in that, would come into play, and that it was inevitable that crypto would be part of that. And I think right now, we're still some way off for something big happening, but it's on the table. It is a talking point, and it's really important. So Bruno, why don't you set the stage here? Maybe a little bit about what the Bretton Woods system is, if those who don't know what that is, but it might be useful, but also what has happened and why is this moment with Russia, potentially China, that cleavage, if you like, between the East and West, and what all that means?
Well, it's a moment of geopolitical crisis, but it's also a moment of crisis of money. And we've seen that play out already for a decade or two. 2008 was a big moment of loss of trust. And I think, it's ironic, we're at a crypto conference and crypto is attacked all the time for creating a kind of money that is not backed by anything and that can be easily programmable and reprogrammable. But in fact, since 2008, we've realized that fiat is just as programmable, reprogrammable, not backed by anything. You can move money from banks and to banks. And now with the Ukraine crisis, I think it's actually a turning point. What happened to the Russian central bank reserves? Russian central bank thought they have 300 billion in reserves in Western central banks and Western financial institutions. And overnight, on the night of 25th of February, it was just pulverized. They were frozen, but they could be confiscated very soon. So it's a moment where we realize, well, this is not really money. This is credit. There's a line somewhere between money and credit. Credit is money you owe, you promise to pay, but when you lose trust in the counterparty, you don't pay anymore. And that's what happened on February 25th. What we're going to discuss today, I think, is what does this mean for the dollar? All over the world, people are asking, should you put your reserves, your hard-won reserves, into the dollar system when overnight it can disappear? And remember, on February 25th, it was kind of a plan developed by Mario Draghi, now Italian Prime Minister, and Janet Yellen.
Former ECB.
From an ECB president. But next time around, I think it's going to be different. Next time around, it's actually going to be public opinion that is going to demand for central bank reserves to be frozen. Brazil is not taking care of the environment, of the Amazon. So perhaps part of their central bank reserves should be diverted to the environment.
Well, it's not as if the freezing of Russia's reserves was politically unpopular, right? It was, but the ramifications of it, and let's break it down. The Bretton Woods system, certainly once the end of the gold peg in 1971, was really built upon the idea that you trusted the US to stand up behind its contractual obligations, that it would honor its, if you had assets in the United States, you've had a contract in the United States, that you would be held on equal par with anybody, domestic or foreign. This is a shift in that. Whether you think it's fair or not, it is a radical change in the foundational element of our international monetary system, right?
Right. Not just trust in America's commitment to to honor these promises, these credit promises, but also trust America's power to keep order, to keep geopolitical order, and to keep inflation in check. We're now at a critical moment when we're starting to realize, particularly in Europe, it's not going to be central banks to keep inflation in check. It's going to be geopolitics. People in Europe, decision makers, but also public opinion, are much more interested in finding out how are we going to assure, secure access to cheap oil, and how is it going to be done through political means. And what the European Central Bank can do is actually very limited. So we're just being thrown into this geopolitical world of conflict and not the previous world of monetary policy conducted by central banks.
I mean, the commodities part is really interesting, Maya. I mean, you live in Israel, right? And you're there in the Middle East, where oil, of course, is so prevalent, and it's such an element of that region's power. And, you know, prices have surged. There's talk that the future may be of a commodity-backed international currency of some sort. You know, this might be a huge opportunity for the Middle East, and interestingly, we're seeing crypto developments there at the same time, right?
Yeah, and I don't think it's a coincidence. I think, just to echo what Bruno said, the contractual obligation of Bretton Woods wasn't just about central banks. It was also about U.S. soft power. It was about the U.S. military willing to essentially police the flow of energy from the Gulf or from everywhere back to the developed world. And what we see post-Ukraine/Russia is that the world is splitting not only into two, but also into three, where you have almost like the neutral states of the Gulf and India come in and say, we don't want to voice a geopolitical opinion, either about the freezing of assets or tech stacks or censorship. We want to be the free zone of trade. And you see more and more people rushing, we were just discussing this backstage, moving to the Gulf because of these the appeal of neutrality without having the geopolitical influence on business or on opinions or on censorship. So in that regards, it's really fascinating. But I think crypto comes into it because we can also use the rails of crypto to provide a cross-jurisdictional bridge between the heavily regulated world that I think the US still has the power to define within the developed world, as we saw in the previous panel from the senators and congressmen, versus the free zone of whatever goes in the Gulf, more lax regulations.
So Nic, what does all this mean for the dollar? I mean, and what, you know, where does the trajectory of what the current Bretton Woods 2 system, as we call it, because 1 was the gold peg, 2 is this fiat version of US hegemony. What is the next phase? Is it a Bretton Woods 3, or is it, or do we throw out the dollar as the you know, underpinning of the system?
Well, Bretton Woods, you know, I don't know if we're going to be able to call it Bretton Woods 3 because, you know, the next conference where we sort of determine the future of these things will probably not be held in New Hampshire. It'll be in a Discord somewhere.
Yeah.
You know? So, look, I basically buy the argument that people like Zoltan Pozsar are making, that, and Bruno just stated nicely, that something fundamentally changed in February 2022, and treasuries were as good as gold. They were the default savings asset to put your nation's accumulated surplus into, and by effectively engaging in a largely extrajudicial process of seizure for a G20 nation, we have defaulted on our sort of implicit promise to the world. And so, you know, I think anyone that is not a staunch ally of the US will be thinking to themselves, am I next? You know, and you might say, well, the standard is just don't invade your neighbor. Well, everyone loves to invade their neighbor, okay? Like, the Saudis are currently waging a war against their neighbor. China is looking at Taiwan. So does that mean that we're gonna freeze their reserves if and when they, you know, do something that offends Washington? I think they're going to be thinking about how to divest themselves of those reserves. And the practical consequence of that is there's just going to be fewer and fewer foreign buyers for US debt, which is going to make life very difficult for the US.
But at the same time, you know, if you talk to anybody around the world about what currency you want to hold other than your own, it still is typically the dollar. In fact, throughout this crisis, we see, as we always see, a flood of money into the safe haven, the dollar. So can we talk a little bit about the separation between that idea, the dollar as an idea, as a mechanism, as a reference of value that the world probably really wants, and this current version of the dollar, which is one that is controlled by a surveillance banking system, and all of the elements of control that come with that? I mean, is that an opportunity for the dollar to sort of, and particularly obviously with stable coins and things like that, to take on a different status that in fact the US doesn't control, but is nonetheless out there and flowing and part of this system?
Yeah, it's hard to reconcile. Like, you look at the practical reality, like stable coins, there's $150 billion of them floating around. That actually does represent kind of a net new demand for treasuries. And that is empirically what people want, especially in emerging markets. At the same time, inflation is 8.6% as of today. So it's kind of like the US has this incredible golden goose, and they still wield this amazing instrument, but they're doing their best through fiscal and monetary coordination to ruin it effectively. Yeah. By excessively spending domestically and causing this inflationary impulse. I think potentially stablecoins are an avenue. If you actually look, about 99% of all stablecoins reference the dollar, which is a ratio that's far higher than the use of the dollar in international trade or in foreign currency reserves. So I do see stablecoins as an opportunity to further internationalize the dollar, but you are going to have to give up some of that control. Yeah. You're not going to be able to do it. No one would want to use stablecoins if they were as heavily surveilled as deposits are in sort of the banking system.
Is that something, Maya, that's possible, though? I mean, clearly giving up control is not something that those who have control do very easily.
Yeah, but what's really, I think, interesting is the inherent clash that we're kind of basically depegging the dollar as a monetary asset and the rails. And it's not necessarily only about control, but it's also who defines what those rails really are, right? And so far, crypto is a few steps ahead of where the regulation really is on one hand. But on the other hand, we see that the dollar has never been stronger, especially given all the political turmoil. Everyone, like you said, runs to the dollar as a safe haven, but also given all the inflation that we're seeing, the dollar versus every other asset just keeps on getting stronger. And that means that people have a lot of belief in the US dollar. They just don't necessarily want to play either by the US rules or by US rails. And not to troll the US, but there's nothing as baffling as someone who is visiting the US and puts out a credit card and doesn't really know how I'm going to pay. Is it a tap? Is it a swipe? Is it an insert? And it just goes to show you how behind a lot of the infrastructure, specifically for payments and anything that has to do with regulation, the US is, even in comparison to other G20 countries. And that's really where crypto kind of fits in, because it's almost like coming out and saying, we as a collective, as a very fluid collective, are essentially designing our own stack. And where and if it touches the US regulatory regime, we're going to basically have some sort of negotiation as to what kind of surveillance everyone will be privy to. And again, this is a byproduct of the fact that I think US government has been very lagging in defining what digital rights we have as individuals and trying to decouple the financial surveillance and digital surveillance of us as people living on Facebook or WhatsApp or Telegram and so forth.
I mean, the word surveillance is really important here. I don't think people quite realize how comprehensive that surveillance system is, right? And we're not talking just about like NSA and the sort of Edward Snowden ideas of surveillance. We're talking simply about KYC, AML, and the way that it is inherently built around the dollar, because ultimately, all roads lead to New York when international transfers and payments are made. So at the end of the day, the United States is the entity that is setting the terms by who gets to participate in that system. But as I said, Bruno, this again is something that is very, very meaningful to those who have power. We're not just talking about policymakers in Washington. We're also talking about Wall Street itself, right? And, we had this really interesting debate yesterday. I think one of the most interesting panels at the Money Reimagined Summit, where you had Rohan Gray, who is representing, is really sort of trying to push for a central bank driven currency. He's working with Rashida Tlaib. You had Dante Disparte from Circle talking really about this sort of open plans stablecoin, and Caitlin Long, who's somewhere in the middle, sort of trying to produce a banking-based stablecoin dollar project. And it really got down to this art of like this right of who gets to define who owns and issues those dollars, and can you do so without this surveillance? And is there real value to remove that surveillance for soft US power? Can you unwrap some of that for us and tell me what your thoughts are on that?
I mean, you said no one wants to give up control, but actually, the United States became the largest financial market in the world and the most powerful precisely because he was able to let go of a great measure of control. If you keep the capital account open, large inflows and outflows of capital makes it much more difficult for US monetary authorities to conduct an independent sovereign monetary policy with consequences for American society, and that's been well studied. But on the other hand, you have this rise of America as a leading financial power with the ability to sanction other countries, but also to attract enormous amount of capital. Now, there's been a process over decades where this has been eroded, where the ability to let go of control has been reversed. And now you have American authorities keeping a very tight lead on all this, not only on monetary policy, but increasingly on capital account and on sanctions policy, and so on. The question is, and I think it's relevant for crypto, will American authorities be able to let go of control and therefore reestablish their place as the world's preeminent financial capital, or will they continue on this path? And at that point, global investors might not see a huge difference between the US and China because they run the same risks, whether they invest in one place or the other. So, you know, when I see it's naive to think that the US would ever consider crypto as a valuable avenue, not only for payments, but also as a store of value. Perhaps central banks all over the world could accumulate crypto in some form. I think that's the big issue right now, whether they'll go down that path. It would be very good for the US. I don't think people are attracted to the dollar because of the dollar currency. They are attracted to the dollar because of the American financial system, which is huge, which is liquid, and which is safe. If you had an American financial system more based on crypto and less based on the dollar, on the USD, it would be just as attractive, and perhaps more over the long or the very long term.
Some of what we're talking about here as well, though, when you mentioned giving up control, is I think this concept of soft power. In that, like, you know, if you give this, you basically have faith in American system, American values, you open everything up, the whole world comes to you, right, under that freedom structure, and then you build power in this very indirect way. And I think back to the 1996 Telecom Act and the way that the US was extremely aggressive in trying to push for an open internet. And of course, you know, the US still maintained sort of certain indirect control over things like ICANN and everything else. But at the end of the day, they really did build this multi-party system that ended up being co-opted by a bunch of Silicon Valley tech giants. But in any case, the principle behind it was this: the bigger and the more open we are, this sort of post-Cold War era of optimism, the better it would be for the United States, right? Nick, do you see anywhere in Washington people starting to think like that? Is there an opportunity? You've talked about maybe the US playing a different kind of stewardship of this system. Is there anything in there that you would see anybody in Washington driving toward?
Well, just look at Austin, right? Look at Senators Lummis and Gillibrand. They wrote the most sanguine and you know, full of depth bill I've ever seen on cryptocurrency. I think there is an awakening that the US can be a steward of this system, as opposed to it being this completely anarchic system that just so happens to have its tendrils in the US and certain hubs in the US. You know, in fact, the US can export American values through the mechanism of cryptocurrency, right? You know, maybe I'll sound jingoistic by saying this, but an enormous fraction of the crypto industry is right here in the US, and this movement is impregnated with ideology, and a lot of the ideology, you know, it's not just like ANCAP libertarian stuff, it's about a respect for property rights. It's about a respect for individual privacy. I think those are great values. And to the extent the US actually acts as an underwriter and a steward of the system, I believe it works to their benefit. I don't believe that Bitcoin or anything is going to destroy or unseat the dollar. We see it as an extension of U.S. financial markets. And certainly I don't identify any other large nation that could possibly steward this technology. China has turned their back on it. I don't know if Russia has the credibility globally to be that steward. To me, it seems like this is actually an opportunity for the U.S. to reassert itself on the international stage with a unifying technology. It's just a matter of giving up that golden goose, which is their sanctions, their beloved sanctions-making ability.
So, Maya, I'd like to turn to a topic that I know that is close to your heart, this idea of dissident tech, right? So, we're talking here about U.S. model, how much control they do or don't have, and what that means for the citizens of the world. But there are now options, right? There are activists, and whether it's they're paid in crypto or they're using encryption systems and so forth, that's another form of this fracturing of the system. How does it play out?
So when you really think about it, we have surveillance financially and we have surveillance digitally. And some of it has been weaponized by different governments in order to police people. And when people flow to the place or the stack of least resistance, it's usually when they're either running away from governments or they're looking to do something very, very nefarious. And I firmly believe that we're going to see a split between where the rule of law of the US and soft power is going to reign supreme, or the EU for that matter, if they get their act together faster. Whereas on the other spectrum, on the other end of the spectrum, we'll see the stack with the most private provisions or protections and security for people who are looking to actually flee or be activists within different stacks. And we first saw this with Hong Kong during the protests back in 2019, when the protesters were looking to organize in ways where the CCP wasn't able to surveil, and they were blocked from big tech, from different digital platforms. And they had to go out and look for other open source applications. Some of them were actually applications that different, ironically enough, political campaigns used for grassroots movements. And we're seeing more and more of those stacks or protocols happen on chain. Why? Or like on crypto? Because it provides people the ability to organize in a seamless fashion and a very permissionless way without having to identify. And one of the most exciting things about crypto and different projects is that we're getting the funding for deep tech that wouldn't have otherwise happened, like zero knowledge proofs and privacy tech, and starting to actually confront the hardcore issues of identity. And this is really where dissidents need to find a way to circumvent the entire system, be it the Chinese or the American surveillance system.
But, okay, I mean, this is where it really gets interesting, but also a little scary, right? Because that power, and you mentioned it from out there, can either be used for these, you've got to run away from some horrible regime, or for some nefarious purpose. That nefarious purpose is getting access to this deep-funded, more accessible, more rapidly growing. We're going to have a session tomorrow with Austin Hill talking about this and how we've got this, it's called the vulnerable world hypothesis, that the technology, the capacity to build really destructive technology is becoming cheaper and cheaper and easier to do, right? So how do we grapple with this? And how do governments grapple with this? Because you certainly want to encourage dissidents where their interests seem to align with your values, and we had this huge conversation about, do we support Ukraine with crypto but not Russia with crypto, right? And this is a huge part of this. So how do we corral this toward good? Because it really could also go awry.
So banning encryption or tech is not an option.
Absolutely.
And I think for some reason, politicians, that's their go-to. So we can't weaponize tech as a political statement, but we should create a framework, a legal one, or some loophole where we can actually assess how the different siloed systems work. And if we go back to the beginning of the conversation of the huge cataclysmic event that we had starting with Ukraine, and how the world has actually started to splinter into about three, we're gonna see three different stacks. And the bridges between these new siloed worlds is probably gonna be crypto enabled. And I think that's where the dissidents will get funneled or screened or something within the legal process. But we can't ban either. What we can do is create the legal protections for the criminals and actually enforce the law, which is something we don't do. And if we're looking at the KYC and AML and the financial surveillance system that was supposed to provide these protections, I think it's also important to acknowledge that what was right when financial regulations were first articulated has failed in general, because we didn't manage to do the KYC or KYB or ban people off of OFAC lists and all that. And instead, when the sanctions hit with Ukraine, what we found out is that a lot of different Russian nefarious entities have essentially used offshore and shadow bankings in order to infiltrate our own financial systems through offshore companies and shell companies and so forth. So sometimes the problem is not necessarily regulatory or technological, but it's the legal structures on paper that enable the more nefarious actors and criminals and law enforcement from being captured by them.
It's a really interesting perspective. I think it's one of the most exciting, but also, fascinating, interesting, and challenging aspects of where things are going, Bruno. I mean, how do you see the interplay between these big geopolitical movements and this emergence of this incredibly empowering technology for doing a ring around of all of that?
And the way I see it, crypto answers a fundamental problem. It's the only form of money we have today that is, as the economists call it, pure outside money. It doesn't correspond to a liability that someone else has or holds. It's not credit. So if you have Bitcoin, it doesn't correspond to a liability someone has. But a treasury is by definition a liability. It's a promise of the American government to pay back to you. And I see, I look around the world today, I see a desperate urge and search for a kind of money that is outside money, that corresponds to something somehow objective, impartial. It doesn't have to be physical stuff like gold, because we cannot program gold, but it has to be something that is outside the matrix of financial relationships, something that stands outside. And in that respect, it could be Bitcoin, it could be another form of crypto, it could be something we don't call crypto 10 or 20 years from now. But it's obvious that everyone is looking for something with these characteristics.
I love that connection with gold, because that's what people throughout history have always turned back to gold, because it was the one thing that was disconnected from politics. But now we have a digital version of that. Nick, I know this is something close to your heart. Can you weigh in with a little more than a minute left in our time here?
Yeah, I'll just say this, over the last 50 years, we've been steadily ceding ground to the surveillance state, and that increasingly now concerns the financial realm, whether it's the state doing it directly, or whether it's private sector entities that are mobilized to engage in mass financial deplatforming. And so, I just look at the pendulum of history, and we're right now at the zenith in terms of the state, having this high leverage ability to control its people, in particular through the financial mechanism. And so it's obvious to me that it's going to swing back. Cryptocurrency is a manifestation of that and will be the prime mover there. The question is, how will the U.S. adapt, right? Will they continue to cling to this delusion that they can control the architecture of finance to achieve, their geopolitical goals, even though it doesn't work, as we saw with the sanctions in Russia? They failed, right? They didn't work. Or will they actually embrace the new model where the individual is fundamentally empowered, and that model enshrines certain beliefs that have been forgotten in this country, but that are core to American values?
All right, we're going to close at that. That was a lot to chew on, everybody. This is a big time. This is a momentous time in history, and the stuff that's being talked about here at Consensus, we're dealing with really, really important issues, and I think these guys have just done a tremendous job breaking it all down for us. So a round of applause for the panel.